Well, good day to all of you who have been able to join us today for this Canada Caribbean Institute launch and discussion of a new book from Ivelaw Griffith. The title of the book is Oil and Climate Change in Guyana's Wet Neighbourhood, Probing Promise and Potential Peril. The discovery of offshore oil reserves in 2015 fundamentally reshaped Guyana's prospects. GDP growth has soared above 40%. In some years, revenues are financing new infrastructure, education, and healthcare. But Guyana must navigate a number of significant challenges going forward. The challenges of proper stewardship of vast new revenue, the threat of climate change that is being driven worldwide by hydrocarbons, diversifying the economy beyond hydrocarbons, strengthening democratic institutions to ensure inclusive prosperity, and ensuring transparency and eliminating corruption, and confronting challenges to its very sovereignty and borders. This is the mix of issues that Professor Griffith's new book explores, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity as the Canada Caribbean Institute to have his book presented and to have an excellent panel prepared to discuss it. We don't have a lot of time today. I'm only going to give brief introductions to our participants. If I gave them the proper introduction, we would take far too much time. Their CVs are on the Zoom platform. You can refer to the longer versions there. But first and foremost, I want to introduce Professor Ivelaw Griffith. He is associated with a number of well-known policy think tanks that focus on the Caribbean and the Americas. He has published widely on Caribbean national security, drugs, and crime issues. He has testified and consulted with US, European, and Canadian governments and military institutes, and he has held leadership positions at the University of Guyana and a number of universities in the United States, including Florida International University, and has received honors from both countries. He and his wife of 4 decades have 2 adult children and 2 grandchildren. Before I turn to Professor Griffith, we're also being joined by 4 people who can help us understand some of these issues. Following Professor Griffith's presentation, we're going to hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll have some time for questions. But I want to introduce each of them right now, and then we'll turn it over to Professor Griffith. First of all, Norman Munro. Dr. Munro is a full professor in the Mechanical and Materials Engineering Department, College of Engineering and Computing at Florida International University, and Distinguished Chair, Faculty of Engineering and Technology at the University of Guyana. His research focuses on the design and deployment of renewable energy systems, extractive metallurgy systems, corrosion, and biomedical devices, and he has extensive experience in the oil and gas industry around the world. He has held several administrative positions at FIU, including department chairman, associate dean, and director of numerous centers. He has published extensively. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including a Fulbright Scholar Award to the University of Guyana, where he oversees ABET accreditation of engineering programs. Next, we have Ambassador Kendrick Hunt. He's a professor in the Department of Economics at Howard University. He served as the Director of Graduate Studies in the Economics Department at Howard from October 2009 to August 2016. He also, in a bit of a change of hats, served a 4-year term as Resident High Commissioner of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana to the Republic of South Africa, with concurrent accreditation to several other African nations. His previous professional, academic, and work experience include positions in Guyana, including Chief Executive Officer, Managing Director at the Guyana Agricultural and Industrial Development Bank. He's been a consultant at the World Bank in Washington and a consultant for the Food and Agricultural Organization. The next panelist is Associate Professor Janet Bulkin. Janet Bulkin is an Associate Professor in the Department of Forest Resources Management in the Faculty of Forestry, University of British Columbia. She is a director of the Oil and Gas Governance Network. She's also a member of the Governing Council of the Commonwealth Forestry Association and the advisory board of the Green Institute, University of Guyana. She is the coordinator of the International Union of Forest Research Organizations Working Party on Indigenous Peoples and Forest Landscapes, and a member of the Task Force on Gender, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Forest-related sectors. She works on green extractivism, community forestry, and independent third-party forest certification systems. We'll be joined a little later by Mr. Joel Bogwandin. He's a director at a company called SphereX. He is a finance professional with nearly 2 decades of experience in financial management, banking, and finance. He leads a team of professionals providing advice to clients on complex financial issues. He's authored numerous articles and research papers on economic and finance issues in Guyana, especially on the oil and gas sector. He's also a commissioner of the Public Procurement Commission, a constitutional body that oversees public procurement in Guyana, and his responsibilities entail ensuring transparency, accountability, and efficiency in the use of public funds. So we have not only a distinguished author presenting his publication, but a distinguished panel in place to provide some comments on the publication. Ivelaw, I would like to kick off our discussion with no further ado by turning it over to you for a presentation on this marvelous new book. So we'll start with you.
Robert, by thanking you for the opportunity to present this work and to observe that it seems as though I have to write the book every year because we had a launch of another book last year. And if we were to keep up the show, I got to have another book next year so we can do a launch at CCI. But I also want to thank Norman and Kenrick, Jeanette, and Joel for not only being here to be part of this presentation, but for taking the trouble and the time to read at least part of the manuscript. It's a fairly heavy lift. And so I thank everyone for the opportunity to facilitate this conversation. I had the good fortune in high school of having a teacher who taught math and Latin. And in high school, she introduced us to this gentleman who was a mathematician, Bertrand Russell, who later on I realized was not just a mathematician, he was a philosopher. And for the last 4 or 5 decades, I've stuck with the proposition of Bertrand Russell's that said that sometimes you've got to hang question marks in facilitating conversations, in understanding things you either know or take for granted. And so I want to use the opportunity, channeling Bertrand Russell, and suggest it may be useful to hang 4 question marks on the conversation about this book. The first question having to do with what exactly is the book intended to do? What are the aims of the book? As well as a sense of how the book is constructed. What is its architecture? I want to use another question mark to ask the question, what are the realities of the petropower pursuits in Guyana? And then turn in question 3 to look at some of the peril realities. What is the potential peril reality? And then what are some of the paradox realities? Because you'll see later on, my proposition, it's not only my proposition, is that Guyana is in a paradoxical set of circumstances. So let's turn to the first question mark, notions about aims and architecture. When you have a chance to read the book, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see that there are 3 aims. I'm not going to read them, but they have to do with understanding the exploration and production dynamics in Guyana. They have to do with having a sense of the social and physical geography and of the vulnerability having to do with climate change, part of the paradox of not only producing oil, but managing the climate change realities. And then I make the argument, and I have an aim that says you really cannot understand elements of the petropower pursuits or the climate change realities unless you focus a little bit of attention on the executable. So we spend some time, actually there are 2 chapters that look at the executable issue. Interesting how I came to write this book. Good friend of mine, the publisher of Ian Randall Publisher, executive chairman of Ian Randall Publisher, Ian Randall, a friend from way back, and Ian was quite instrumental when I was at University of Guyana in helping us to establish University of Guyana Press. And I got this email from Ian one day that says, I've been following your writings on Guyana's oil and climate change issues in small states. Well, why don't you write a book for us? He said it can be a little book. Turns out that it's not just a little book. It's a book almost 430 pages. And the book has a central thesis, as I suspect every worthy academic missive should have. The thesis says that in Guyana, there is a paradoxical set of circumstances where, on the one hand, Guyana is pursuing this petropower trajectory, which has the reality of contributing to climate change, to global warming, and at the same time, by virtue of the carbon sink it presents and has, it is helping to deal with climate change. So I think the paradox that lies within that arena is what the central thesis of the book is all about. I'm thankful to a good friend, Albert Schwartz, distinguished scientist, who wrote the foreword. And there's a wealth of tables and figures and maps and boxes in the book. You know, as I wrote the book, I thought it might be useful to pull into 1 or 2 pages some basic facts about Guyana. And I call them my 20 fun factoids. Simple things like, what's the size of the Stabroek block, which is producing the mother lode of the oil? Where exactly is the onshore oil in Guyana? Because although the conversation is about offshore oil, the reality is that Guyana has onshore oil resources in Region 9. And insofar as we're concerned about the climate change reality, the physical and social geography, how long is Guyana's Atlantic coast? These are some of the, what I call, fun factoids. But once you go into the real question of the second question, what are the petropower realities? I suggest that it's important before getting to the oil production and exploration, it's important to share the context which is in a governmental arena that has certain parameters central to which have to do with the governmental arena, that describe some of the regulatory frameworks having to do with that arena. And we'll come to see later on that a lot of the conversation about the bounty has to do with the utilization and the investment of that bounty, which means you've got to say a little bit about the Natural Resource Fund. And I have a conversation with the Natural Resource Fund showing in one graph, figure 2.3, what a portrait at the end of 2024 of the fund was all about. But I think it's important to recognize that, as with any society, the dynamics of the political environment have to do with much more than the governmental arena. The importance of the non-governmental arena should not be lost on us. And I remember reading decades ago something that Charles de Gaulle said, and I invoke Charles de Gaulle: politics is too serious a matter to be left to politicians. And so there is, for me, a healthy conversation about the non-governmental arena, the role and performance of the chambers of commerce, of the civil society organizations. And there's an extensive conversation about how the civil society organizations are engaging in the dynamics of helping to decide what are utilization challenges, what are production and exploration opportunities needed to become having a conversation about. There is a useful conversation, I think, about part of that non-governmental arena having to do with litigation. Very healthy conversation, I think, about how individuals and civil society organizations are beginning to use the very governmental arena, the very democratic mechanism that says the role of the court should not be underestimated. And there's a conversation in there where I lay out some of the significant cases beginning in shortly after the discovery began in 2015. So that is an important part of the non-governmental arena. But here's a reality of Guyana that in many respects is unique. So large a proportion of Guyanese and Guyanese descent people exist in this global commons. And I have a table which I show here, figure 2.4. Guyana has the dubious distinction of having the single largest diaspora. And so it's important in asking the question, what are the dynamics of the engagement of the non-governmental arena? It's important to talk a little bit about how is this diaspora engaged in the conversations about oil? How is this diaspora engaged in the conversation about climate change? And I focus on two diaspora networks, one of which is the Oil and Gas Governance Network, a set of Guyanese professionals in a variety of respects outside of Guyana and in Guyana who help to shape the knowledge about the oil and gas, who help to shape the opportunities to figure out what the society should be doing, not only what the government should be doing, but what the society should be doing in helping to have accountability, to have transparency, to have utilization of the resources in a way that benefits the whole of society, not just one component of the society. And in addition to the Oil and Gas Governance Network, I spent some time on the Guyana Business Journal, which operates out of New York, which is intended not only to produce a written, but has facilitated some conversations. And I have a table there that shows the wealth of information over a period of 3 or 4 years, how the Guyana Business Journal has been helping to galvanize the diaspora and Guyana-based folks to educate, to have people broaden the perimeters of their knowledge about things oil and gas and things climate change. And then we turn attention to what I call the treasure chest in the basement. And I use basement to represent what's there below the sea in Guyana. And there's some basic realities which cannot be overlooked. When the discovery was made in 2015. And very often you hear the conversation about Guyana's oil and gas, and you hear only about ExxonMobil. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that ExxonMobil, in the context of the Stabroek block, is part of a consortium. Important part of that consortium is Hess, which owns 30% of the consortium investment, and a Chinese company, China National Offshore Oil Company. There's an interesting dynamic which I talk a little bit about in the afterword of the book. Some of the realities of the positioning between Hess and Chevron and ExxonMobil. In a couple of months, actually, we should hear what the arbitration panel that met in London a few weeks ago says about Chevron intending to buy out the Hess stake. And Exxon and Sienna OOC have objected, saying that they have the right of first refusal, and so on. So it's important as part of the conversation about that second question mark to paint a portrait of not only what happened with the discovery in 2015, May 2015, not only happened with First Oil in December 2019, but what are some of the dynamics beyond those two periods. Interesting, I think, in my view, layout of where the blocks are, layout of where the FPSOs, the floating production storage platforms are. And we know that that's a changing dynamic. Recently, the fourth FPSO called One Guyana is beginning to present the opportunity to make its productivity manifest. So there's a conversation in that context about the production dynamics. We know that Guyana has been producing oil not for local consumption. And so it's important to spend some time in the book, which I did, asking the question, where is this all going? And there is a graphic there that showed for 2023, Europe and North America commanded most of the exports, bought most of Guyana's oil. And you can see from the graphic a 3.6 dramatic increase. Starting reality, I described the ExxonMobil Stabroek block pursuit as what some scholars call BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious gold projects. 4 years that it took to move from discovery to production, from discovery to first oil, is a remarkable departure from the normal 7 to 8 years that it takes. So I think it's important to describe that reality of the fast pursuit, what I call a BHAG. But we know that it's not only the 11 billion barrels of oil. There's significant gas in the basement, and there's a conversation about how much gas, what's the intent in the gas to energy project, what is intended, what are some of the dynamics of the financing. And understandably, when you have a resource in a small country like Guyana, where their investment by American companies, the American government takes a keen interest, not only for geoeconomic reasons, but for geopolitical reasons. And I explain in the case of the financing for the gas to energy project, how the geopolitics involving China and the United States have manifested itself in the financing coming from the United States Import-Export Bank, that gas to energy politics and gas to energy project. Of course, you can't overlook some of the controversy in relation to the production and management of the oil industry. And there's I think, a useful conversation about not only the realities of the 2016 production sharing agreement, but some of the realities of the fallout potential in regards to oil spills. There is a healthy conversation, I think, in relation to setting out some of the challenges and opportunities in that respect. And I suspect Kenrick and maybe Jeanette will talk a little bit about some of that dynamic. The afterword that I wrote captures some of the efforts on the part of the government to deal with the oil spills with regard to legislation. And there is a useful, I think, conversation about the oil spill legislation and the challenges presented by some civil society individuals and organizations. All the things I've written over the years, I like to infuse some of the arts. And a good friend of mine, James in New York, who is a pastor and a poet, he wrote this wonderful poem about Guyana oozing oil. And I asked his permission. I said, Jim, let me put part of that poem in the book. And I want to commend to you Guyana oozing oil, which captures some of the reality in a poetic way of what Guyana has and will be facing with the pursuit of its oil trajectory. So we move to the third question. I know we have only a few minutes left, Robert. I'm mindful of the time myself. And for me, it's important in asking the question, what are the potential peril realities facing Guyana? I define those peril realities in two categories. What I call on the Western Front peril reality, and what I call climate change reality, peril realities. And I think it's important to ask the question, I anticipate a question being asked quite early, and people who might ask, why is Professor Griffith talking about, in 2 chapters, about Essequibo? Well, for me, you got to talk about the Essequibo because the oil bounty intended from this offshore discovery is intended for all of Guyana. But if there's no Essequibo, that project is going to be significantly undermined. But hear this. To understand the potential realities of the peril regarding climate change, you've got to understand the Essequibo. The question is, what exactly does this Essequibo represent? It represents 74% of Guyana. Guyana has 10 administrative regions. The Essequibo involves 6 of those 10 regions, all of regions 1 and 2, parts of region 3, 7, 8, and 9. As a matter of fact, I sometimes startle people with whom I speak, non-Guyanese and even Guyanese, and I say to them this: if you were to make some comparisons geographic with regard to Essequibo and other places, did you know that Jamaica can fit into the Essequibo 14.5 times? Did you know that the Essequibo is bigger than all of England? Did you know that Costa Rica can fit into the Essequibo 3 times? So we're not talking about a small area of land. You're talking about significant territory. As a matter of fact, if you were to take away the Essequibo from Guyana, you'd be left with just 21,400 square miles of territory. In other words, you'd be left with less than half the size of Cuba. And then when you consider that the Essequibo challenge is not the only challenge, territorial challenge Guyana is facing. Guyana faces a challenge on the eastern front from Suriname, 6,000 square miles in the New River Triangle. So I think it's important to keep in mind the significance of this Essequibo territory and what it means for the overall Guyana development project. But it is not only the size, I argue, of the Essequibo that matters. It's what's in the Essequibo, resource-wise and people-wise. There is where you've got some significant gold. And Robert, it may interest you to know that Canada is one of the leading, Canadian companies constitute some of the leading foreign investors pursuing the gold in Guyana, especially in the Essequibo. Diamond is in there, manganese is there, uranium is there. I did a study for the Perry Center a few years ago, and I have a map that shows where in the Essequibo there's this uranium. As a matter of fact, current vice president, when he was president, Barra Jagdeo, made a trip to Iran at their invitation in regard to Iran's interest in exploring the uranium deposits in Guyana. And so it's not only the oil that's there, and it's not only the offshore oil from the Essequibo. It's the biodiversity, it's the agricultural lands, it's the rich forestry in that area. But I like often, Robert, to put graphics to represent. And if you ask how might the peril in regard to the Essequibo be represented graphically, you have on the left the incorporation of the Essequibo by Venezuela in its official map. They call it Guyana Essequiba. And you have to the right, what would be Guyana if Venezuela were to get the Essequibo? That would be Guyana. I'll tell you an anecdote. I was in Hamburg, Germany, a couple of months ago. This is a conference on trafficking of drugs to Europe from the Caribbean and South America. And I'm sitting, Robert and colleagues, at this presentation, and one of the presenters who was doing her virtual presentation was from Caracas. And she was talking about what the battle, the struggle in Venezuela to deal with the drugs and the organized crime. And she has a map of Venezuela, and she's talking about what the government is doing in Guyana Essequiba. I'm sitting there smiling. Here it is, and this is not a government official. This is a non-governmental organization head. The point I'm trying to make is that in the public and private space in Venezuela, Essequibo is operationally theirs, leaving aside their inauguration of this pretense governor a few months ago. So I think it's important to recognize what Essequibo represents insofar as the governance of this nation. You had some interesting dynamics, some efforts not only to inaugurate a governor for the Essequibo, but making moves to try to kind of counter what the ICJ potential. Maybe we can come back to talk about some of that later on. But I call this slide Back to the Future because a few weeks ago, Venezuela did something which it started doing in the 1970s, making objections to things that have to do with economic pursuits by Guyana. And they objected while at a meeting in Brazil, they objected to a conversation that involved in the Essequibo, saying that they cannot be part of any, the Essequibo conversation should not happen because the territory belongs to them. So I think the dynamics of the Essequibo question central to the question of Guyana's development and central to the climate change realities. And so I want to, knowing what the time constraints are, suggest that
Ivelaw, you've got about
suggest
4 minutes, okay, if we're going to stay on track.
All right, thanks much. I want to suggest that not only are the peril realities regarding the Essequibo are important to consider, but the peril realities regarding the environmental issues. And I spent some time talking about social geography, the physical geography, and how is it that the rising sea level and the heavy rainfall are presenting vulnerabilities, and the rising sea level, given the coastal arrangement, creates some vulnerabilities where the nation need to be doing some things differently. I spent some time talking about a little bit about this new effort, this new city, Silica City. And I make the argument that Silica City will not save the society, it will not save Guyana, given what the realities of the Atlantic coastal challenges are. But I think it's important to focus a little bit on that. I want to share with you something that the World Bank in a 2024 report said. Guyana is at risk of climate-induced hazards, including increase in heavy rainfall and related occurrences of flooding. Research shows that the impact of rising sea levels and the intensified storm surges in Guyana will be among the greatest in the world. There are clear and present dangers in regard to Guyana and climate change. My final question has to do with the paradox. And I want to leave readers and maybe conversations from Norman and Cyril, Kenrick and Jeanette in regard to that. But I want to move to the end to suggest that in considering the paradox in the future, you've got to look beyond the global warming and the carbon. You've got to look beyond the technical. You've got to ask the question about values. You've got to ask the question about institutions. You've got to ask the question about political stability and racial harmony. All important. And I invoked on page 319, Robert, something that Dame Jane Morris Goodall said, which I share, views that I share in regard to pondering the future. And there's a distinguished Guyanese poet and playwright, John Agard, who's been living in London for a while now. And I thought, let me leave at the end of the book some things that John Agard said. If we look towards the future, you're talking about inheritance. Here are things you want to keep in mind. If we, the children of the meek, should inherit an earth whose rainforest lungs breathe a tale of waste, an earth where the ailing sea shudders in its own slick. If we, the children of the meek, should inherit an earth where the grass goes nostalgic at the mere mention of green, and the sky looks out of its depth when reminded of blue. If we, the children of the meek, should inherit such an earth, then we ask of the future one question: should we dance or break into gnashing of teeth at the news of our inheritance? I think I want to leave it there in regard to where those 4 question marks may be hung, about the aims of the book, about the realities regarding petropower, about the potential peril realities regarding both the Essequibo and climate change, and about realities about the paradox that presents itself overall. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that quick run through of what is a much deeper and more detailed book. I appreciate the overview. I just want to flag for everyone that we've been joined by Joel Bagwandin. He had to come a little late, as I mentioned at the beginning, but Joel I'm going to go through a number of panelists before I get to you, but we'll certainly hear from you in a few minutes. My remarks at the beginning, I decided to cut in half a little bit and just finish them here at the end of Ivelaw's presentation. I mentioned at the beginning that this was a Canada Caribbean Institute event. Just for those who aren't aware, the CCI is a virtual collaboration of 13 universities and colleges in Canada and the Caribbean. It has as broad objectives promoting the Canada-Caribbean relationship, obviously, but also to encourage collaboration between our member institutions, these post-secondary institutions, and encouraging connections between scholars, researchers, business, and civil society, and also where we can to identify challenges and opportunities in the relationship. Our principal activity every year is a research symposium, but alongside that, throughout the year, we try to organize panel discussions such as this to inform on some of the important issues in our two regions. I would invite you to follow our website and subscribe to our newsletter. Just a couple of administrative details. We will be posting a video of this panel on the CCI website. I will send a message to all registered audience members when it's available, and I would urge you all to share it with friends and colleagues who may not have been able to join us today. I can also say that we're very fortunate that University of West Indies TV, UETV, will be rebroadcasting the panel as well sometime in the future, and I'll try to notify people of that as well. And I'd like to thank UE for putting more eyeballs on our discussion today. Finally, I should say that this is a very detailed publication. The discussion will certainly not exhaust consideration of the issue it raises. If you want to pick up a copy of the publication, Oil and Climate Change in Guyana, it's published, as Ivelaw said at the beginning, by Ian Randall Publishing, and it's available on Amazon. So for those who want to explore that down the road, I wanted to mention that. Now, I would like to turn to Professor Norman Munro. I've already introduced him, and he will focus on some of the issues around oil and gas and climate change. So, Professor Munro, I would turn it over to you. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if we're going to stay on time, we need to try to condense presentations into about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
So we can see your screen, yes.
Very good. So Ivelaw asked me to talk about oil and gas and climate change. And so the outline that I will present is as follows. I'll talk a little bit about ultra deep water oil and gas exploration. I'll talk about the Guyana-Suriname Basin and the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and the opportunities for Guyana, and then conclusions. Well, my entrance in the oil and gas exploration occurred in 2006. At that time, I was the director of the Applied Research Center at Florida International University, and we co-sponsored a workshop entitled Security and Prosperity Partnership North American Forum, Development of Opportunities in Deep Water Oil and Gas. Now, at this meeting, you had stakeholders from the oil and gas companies, Exxon Mobil, Chevron, etc. You have government officials, you have academicians, and we all convened at the think tank institution, Baker Institute in Houston, Texas. And the purpose of this meeting was just to discuss this new frontier of ultra deep water oil and gas exploration. As you may be aware, a lot of exploration have occurred around the world, but never under what you call ultra deep water conditions, where you need more advanced technology for the high pressures and the type of temperatures you find at depths of over 1,500 meters. So that's the category for ultra deep, 1,500 meters and onwards. And so I've conducted research on oil and gas for the Department of Energy, and from 2006, my attention was drawn to what is called the Golden Triangle for deep water oil and gas exploration. And as you could see here, if you look, I say the Gulf of Mexico, but it's the Gulf of America. Some folks want it to be called that way. So you can see the US Gulf, Brazil, and West Africa. Now, if you look at it geologically, what you have on the Atlantic coast by Brazil and West Africa, it's a mirror image in terms of the geology and the oil-bearing terrain. And of course, this is before you had the continental drift. And so the exploration that was being done off the coast of Brazil under ultra deep water conditions were very similar to what was being conducted off the coast of Africa. So you have this mirror image formation on the West African side of the Atlantic, which is analogous to the discoveries in Brazil's Santos Basin. Now let's look at the Southern Caribbean oil and gas reserves. As most of you are aware, Guyana has about 11.6 billion oil equivalent barrels of established reserves. And my feeling from the number of wells being drilled, I can see that number climbing. We're currently producing 650 billion barrels per day, and it is projected to increase to 1.3 million barrels per day by 2027. When you look at the gas reserves, we are about 17 trillion cubic feet. When you look at Suriname, Suriname has about 3.5. And look at where Trinidad is, 455 million. This is 3.5 billion oil equivalent barrels for Suriname. Trinidad has 3.2 billion of prospective reserves, and they're currently producing 2.8 billion cubic feet. Ivelaw spoke about the territorial dispute that is ongoing, and I'm very happy to see that there is legislation for unitization, and governments and regulators on both sides, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Suriname, will have to agree on how to manage common resources via unitization. We talk about net zero carbon by 2050. How will we get there? Is it Petro-CARICOM versus resuscitation of Petro-Carib, as some of you may remember? The good thing is the Guyana-Suriname oil and gas basin will become one of the 10 most prominent producers in the next decade. Guyana and Suriname can continue to advocate for a zero carbon economy despite producing oil. But what is foreseeable is the Caribbean Energy Alliance, where you have players such as Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. Now let me switch to climate change. This is just a schematic representation showing all of the activities by humans using CFCs as propellants, cars with oil and petroleum engines, greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels. It's trying to escape the atmosphere, but because of the The gases, the short wavelengths are converted to longer wavelengths, which is infrared region, and it causes heating or global warming that is contributing to climate change. Now, what are these gases? Now, this chart just shows the concentration, lifetime, sources, and the global warming potential of some of the main gases. And some of the main ones are carbon dioxide, methane. If you look at the lifespan of some of these, for example, the fluorohydrocarbons, etc., or the perfluoromethane, you can see greater than 50,000 lifetime years. So they're not destroyed. Here you have the main human activity that have resulted in the emission of these. And to the right, you have the global warming potential. So whenever we speak of carbon profile or carbon footprints, we talk in terms of carbon dioxide, which has a global warming potential of 1. And everything is measured in terms of carbon dioxide. So for example, the same amount of carbon dioxide is 1/23 the warming potential of, say, the same volume of methane, and so on. So that you could see, for example, at the bottom, sulfur hexafluoride is 22,200 times greater in warming the atmosphere than the same amount of carbon dioxide. But fortunately, the concentration, as you could see from the pre-industrial time, which is the left column, to say 1998, and this is parts per million by volume, you see it's very low, fortunately. So all of these hydrocarbons are very low in concentration as compared to, say, carbon dioxide, which, as you can see here, is 365 and growing. Nevertheless, the main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, succinylfluoride, fluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. What are the consequences of climate change? As we know, both the North and Southern Pole, the ice cap is melting. So you have a visual display of what's happening to the polar ice cap. But what are the major impacts of climate change? As you can see, it would affect agriculture and food security, forest composition, health and productivity, water resources, water quality. Ivelaw spoke about coastal erosion, inundation, and the cost of prevention. In Guyana's case is the seawalls, species and natural areas such as biodiversity, modification of the ecosystems, and human health infectious diseases, dengue and malaria and so on can increase. And so the net result of this temperature increase is sea level rise and more rain, as we were experiencing. Now, here are some pictures of what's happening along Guyana's coast. The seawall along Carifesta Avenue, you can see how the water is overflowing. The seawall next to the Kitty Pump Station. Stabroek Market, our famous land site, inundated with water. All along, even the west coast Demerara, you could see inundation. Once the water gets over the wall into communities, it's hard to remove it. Lower East Coast Demerara again, flooding. Ogle Airport, inundated in the flood of 2005. And where both Ivelaw and I worked for some time, the University of Guyana, flooded in 2005. Now, if you were to look at our climate change experience, it has given us a preview of what could happen. So if you look at the pre-disaster in orange and post-disaster scenarios in terms of agriculture, commerce, transport and communications. You see the peril of the post-disaster scenarios. And this table here is a summary, shows a summary of the damage in relation to selected macroeconomic variables. And I've highlighted, for example, damage as a percentage of export of goods. You could see 90.7%. When you look at the damage as a percentage of gross domestic investment, in terms of totals, direct and indirect. And so one can expect floods to occur and how the economy can be affected. Now, what's happening in terms of fossil fuels and the climate pledge? This chart here shows net zero emissions by 2050. But that's very unrealistic because globally, you have low international cooperation, and realistically, it will probably be by 2090. If you were to look at the primary energy consumption by energy source, where we look at nuclear, there's a lot of interest now in modularized, smaller nuclear reactors. It's relatively safe. This is expected to increase somewhat. Of course, renewables is an upward trend. Countries like the United States and India, and of course China, are pushing for coal. Natural gas will increase. If you were to look at historical projections, 2020 to the left and by 2050 to the right, I expect this to increase for nuclear. Natural gas will decrease somewhat. And based on what's happening right now with geopolitics, I expect coal to also increase somewhat. What is OPEC?
Before, you've got just under 3 minutes now, okay?
Very good. Nearly finished. In terms of OPEC share, right now in 2020, it's about 34%. By 2050, it might be about 52%. But look at what happens with regards to critical minerals in terms of metric tons by 2050. The demand for minerals, lithium, rare earths, copper, etc., is going to be a great demand. And this is the share of solar and renewables is expected to increase. Guyana is very much dependent on its heavy fuel for electricity. Suriname, 59% from hydro. Trinidad and Tobago, about 95%. But electricity generation from natural gas is about 4 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas for diesel, it's about 50. So regional industrial development is something that is very foreseeable. The global demand for ammonia fertilizer is going to be a driver for collaboration between TNT and Guyana and Suriname. Trinidad and Tobago is offering its plants. Hydrogen production by catalytic pyrolysis of natural gas could be very attractive, as well as electrolysis once you have cheap energy. And byproducts can be useful, such as biochar could be good for agriculture. And we're trending towards what you call the 1-1-1. That is $1 per kilogram of hydrogen in 1 decade. And some researchers at FIU, including some Guyanese, are working on hydrogen production and renewable energy projects, which I'm happy to see. And so in conclusion, regional cooperation would be very important. And the use, if we can use the resources derived from oil and gas to develop renewables, such as hydro, solar, wind, and etc., the region will be very, very much in the mix and improve in its resources and their economies. It should be noted that investments in renewable energy have a very high internal rate of return on investments. But once we implement adaptation measures across all vulnerable sectors of the economies, we'll be in good shape. Governments, businesses, investors, and citizens must work together utilizing affordable and reliable arrangement under the CARICOM umbrella. The CARICOM single market and economy could be used as the framework to facilitate intra-regional investments and business opportunities. But we have to look at the diaspora. As Ivelaw said, over 36% of Guyanese live abroad. We can utilize diaspora trained engineers to help build and maintain energy systems. And to conclude, in the words of Neville Trotz, who used to be my boss at UG, the regional energy cooperation between Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname can demonstrate one way in which poor developing countries can face the paradox of being a fossil fuel producer and at the same time espouse the tenets of the Paris Agreement and the global imperative to achieve a zero carbon world by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and I appreciate you managing the time. I just wanted to, before I turn to Ambassador Kendrick Hunt, I just wanted to mention to the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and to the extent we have some time at the end, we'll be more than happy to try to answer them. But I would turn it over to you now, Ambassador, for your presentation.
Thank you. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much. My presentation will cover two basic areas. And before I begin, I must say thank you to Dr. Lloyd Griffith for his work. It's a commendable achievement in putting together all the information that we look at in this book, and it will have long-term implications of how Guyana will develop over time. My contribution tonight will look at two specific areas. Yes, the diaspora engagement and climate change. Part one deals specifically with some of the remittances that Guyanese send from overseas. And just 4 points I wanted to make here. The largest source of remittances come from the United States, where most Guyanese live. Guyanese have the largest diaspora group coming from the United States, and they transfer monies to families and friends at home in Guyana. And the monies are used for various things: food, rent, health, transportation, legal matters, education, other. There are so many other things attached, but let me just go specifically to how remittances are related in some way to how exports are. And essentially, when we look at the total remittances that Guyanese send home, in 2022, it was $539.1 million. And in 2024, it was $565 million US. And there's an estimate. And if you look at the major exports in the past, it was sugar, which now is just less than $25 million US over the last few years. They've lost the special prices that they had with the European Union. Rice is growing at 254 million in 2024. Bauxite is an interesting characteristic for us. It was much larger in the past, but there's just a Chinese firm, I believe, working in Guyana now, and they need to take a closer look at how that is organized. And then you have gold. Gold, as you know, the price for an ounce of gold is over $3,000 US today. And compared with a couple of years ago, it's just like $400 US per ounce. So this is an interesting phenomenon taking place in that particular market because of how the changes are taking place with respect to international exchange rates and currencies. Timber is just about 25 million a year from the exports, and crude oil, which is a huge change to Guyana's operations. In 2024, it was 17.9 billion. What is interesting here is that total exports out of Guyana doesn't mean that Guyanese own 17.9 billion. What we come from that share of 17.9 billion is only 14.5%, and it's roughly 2.6 billion. So to talk in Guyana terms of GDP being influenced by oil, it's more or less an overestimation of what we will actually get. And here, our 14.5% is just 2.6 billion. But what is more interesting for Guyana is that the government of Guyana has to pay the taxes for the company operating in Guyana. That's Hess, Exxon, and CNOC. And if you were to do the simple math and subtract what the government of Guyana has to pay in real terms, we're only left with $202 million US. So essentially, we're not really getting a kind of return from what the oil represents based on the PSA contract that we're looking at. But it's a conversation for a little bit later. Now, what else do we see from the diaspora? The diaspora in Guyana, from Guyana over in the United States and elsewhere, they help out with special arrangements for health arrangements. They have doctors who will go home and provide free services. They pay their own way and help. One particular company, Guyanese non-profit organization, Guy Metro, they help with diabetics patients at the Davis Memorial Hospital. You have modern technology allows a lot of communication in real time to services from professionals, and this can save lives, particularly in health. Then you have the Diaspora Alumni Associations. Many of the high schools students from Guyana who've graduated and living overseas have their special clubs and associations, and they turn around and send things home to assist those schools that they were once students in. And that's a very huge contribution that goes into those schools. And then there are contributions made, a difference in the lives of the current students when they receive these contributions. You have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who are involved in cooperation and the diaspora, and they're usually involved in matters related to projects, energy, economic diversification, economic development. And Dr. Griffith on page 107 goes into quite a lot of details with some of those things there. And then you also have the diaspora professional engagements. It was mentioned early on, you have the Oil and Gas Governance Network, which is a non-political, non-profit organization with a 501c3 status. And they allow us to focus on the rule of law, environmental protection, financial norms, among other things that are of interest to ensuring that Guyana remain in a focused direction in dealing with what is important for the country going forward. You have technology transfer, again from the diaspora, but unlike training takes place. You have diaspora and cultural exchanges, where people who are trained in the United States will do things for people in Guyana. They'd go home and do various things for them. And generally, remittances, we call, enhance the well-being of the Guyanese people. But while it results from the loss of workers in the local labor market in Guyana, it is a major source of foreign exchange. For the flow of remittances to Guyana is certainly a benefit that cannot be denied, given the size of what we just looked at in the previous slide. It's a huge contribution, and even though we don't have them in the labor markets at home, their contribution to Guyana is really substantial. Now, I would like to go to part 2 of my presentation. It deals with oil and climate change in Guyana with Neighbourhood, and probing promises, gifts, what I call a gift. I know Professor Griffith refers to it as a promise and a potential peril. I kind of switch it around a little bit and just add a promise being a gift that we have, and a peril being what could end up being a loss for us. Tell us here that climate change is premised on the notion there is overheating of the environment due to the surplus of carbon dioxide and other elements in the atmosphere. Overheating results in melting of ice caps, rising sea levels, flooding, changes that affect plants, animals, and overall balance in the environment. So the source of the problem generally here for us is excessive use of oil in society with insufficient attention given to the waste disposal, the CO2, that overwhelms the balance of nature with unlimited pollution. And they tell us here that a solution to the problem would be a carbon sink that is not overwhelmed by excessive amount of CO2 and greenhouse gases that are dumped into the environment. And here I have a little diagram showing how this kind of plays out. Essentially, it says a carbon sink is a natural or artificial reservoir that absorbs and stores more carbon from the atmosphere than it releases. Essentially, it is anything that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This process helps mitigate climate change by reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So on your left-hand side, they show you big buildings where we do business with them and cars and transportation. You have waterways, which takes in the CO2 and stores it for us. And then to the extreme right, you have plants. Plants are so important for our existence and our survival as people on this planet. You know, plants are special because they provide, first of all, they deal with our waste, and they provide us oxygen to keep us going. So if you were to look at long-term difficulties you would have, if you don't have a viable forest operation, we can be in such serious trouble across the planet that we live on. I just put together a simple diagram here showing you how plants are involved with a process called photosynthesis. And out of that process, you would get oxygen. They take in the CO2, and through that process, they release to us oxygen, which we need. And if you don't have plants around us, we will have difficulties of what I call the peril on the other side. If there are no plants and there's an abundance of CO2 in the atmosphere, this traps heat in the Earth's atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect and global warming. So in the context of looking at going forward for Guyana and elsewhere, plants become important for us. Guyana has an extensive range of natural resources. And I look at some of the gifts that we have. Guyana has the most densely forested countries in South America, has rainforests covering about 87% of its landmass. Guyana rainforests, part of the Guyana Shield, are instrumental in regulating rainfall throughout the Amazon basin, significantly impacting global climate regulation. You have Guyana has maintained the lowest deforestation rate on Earth, creating a massive forest carbon sink that stores an impressive 9.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So we have basically a cleaning operation that is valued for the entire world, but we at home in Guyana don't really understand what it is we have, and we have to kind of wise up to what it is we have there. Guyana is a rich, biodiverse environment as well, and I list some of the things that we have, a range of things which I wouldn't go through, but you can see again, having a large forest and plants and waterways, which I'll come to in a minute, helps us with the kind of environment that will keep carbon CO2 stuff under control. Guyana's Amazon rainforest generates significant rainfall and regulates their carbon sink operations, which I'll get to again shortly. Protection of this ecosystem is vital for the environmental health of the world and in mitigating climate change difficulties. So I just had a quick look from Dr. Griffith's book. He has here the 4 natural regions of Guyana. You have low coastal plains, you have the hilly, sandy, and clay arrangements that we have. You have the hinterland forest, timber, gold, diamonds, other minerals are there, and you have the Wipimuni savannas. And if you look at this list, Region 3, or we call Natural Region 3, is more than 60,000 square miles. And if you were to break the entire 83,000 square miles down into land, area, and water, you'd see we have roughly 76,000 plus square miles with land area and water of 6.9 thousand square miles as well. Now, one of the interesting things about Guyana is the many waterways that we have. One of the longest rivers in Guyana, which goes from almost the border of Brazil to the Atlantic coast, is the Essequibo River. It's over 630.1 miles long. And you'd see the diagram to the right there, many of the rivers that we have connect to that particular major Essequibo River. So you're looking at an environment that is conducive for dealing with trapping CO2 in what is exposed to us in the atmosphere. You have the waterways, you have the forests, and you have all those plants to help deal with some of the concerns that we're dealing with for CO2 control. Now, I just go into a little bit more detail again from Dr. Griffith's book, looking at the Essequibo.
Just to flag, we've got about 3 minutes if we're going to stay on track.
Yes, sure. And therefore, I just will share again, go through quickly with some of this. These are some of the natural resources that Guyana have, what I call renewable and non-renewable resources. And again, we don't know in quantity and quality what it is we have there, but there's work to be done to have that sorted out. Now, again, we have some additional things for hydropower possibilities. Dr. Griffith refers to 10 of the major ones that he identified. Hydropower is a possible way in dealing with climate change matters because they could deal without us using some of the other things that we spoke about. Promise, again, there's a conflict with Guyanese. Some are against the use of fuel, some are interested in balancing the arrangement that we have there. Again, some of the other concerns we have, the use of mercury in gold could cause a problem. You have the extraction of gold, which, if it's not properly done, we can have the environment distorted. You have timber extraction without a silviculture program, you end up in trouble there as well. You have contaminated water from the oil operations, which is the water is supposed to be pumped back into the holes in the Atlantic. It's not being done. We can have some problems there. So I go through some of that. I refer again to greenhouse gases. And this is an interesting little diagram which looks at what it is we're looking for to get a balance or an equitable share of what we have. Basically, most of the arrangements we have with natural resources are not done properly for us. We have a win-win that we should work towards. Right now, we're in a win-lose situation in the kind of contracts we have, and there's room for improvements in those areas. Negative impact of climate change. Again, I'm referring to some of the points raised by Dr. Griffith. I wouldn't burden you with that again. And again, what should be the focus? We have various international agencies trying to work in Guyana to help us going in that direction. You have a government program dealing with green state development strategies, something that's required. And one of the benefits then we must concern ourselves with is a benefit received without a contribution can result in more pollution. And that's one of the concerns that we must deal with. Dr. Griffith says, in addition to military, political, and economic concerns, we must also include in our national planning and development what impact the environment should be dealt with to deal with some of the concerns there. Lastly, Guyana and climate change. I look at some of the perils and what I call the gifts that we have. I wouldn't go over those in detail, but I go to specifically what it is that has happened so far. President Obama says, hey, we could price carbon at $42 per ton. It was changed down to $5 a ton by President Trump. President Biden raised it to $190. I know we have a new arrangement coming in place soon. I don't know what the final details will be, but this is one example of where we stand today. And now considerations. Net carbon sink countries should be compensated for their net positive sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. That's something that we should be looking at. Should Guyana be compensated for ensuring that it maintains our forests and other concerns? Those are some of the questions I think the world needs to address. Those countries that are net carbon sink institutions should be compensated to help deal with some of this stuff that we're dealing with. If so, what should be the compensation and who should pay? Should polluters pay? My contention is that polluters should really pay to keep our house in order, or else we all suffer. Thank you very much. I think I'm finished at this point.
Thank you very much, Kendrick, and I appreciate you having to rush through the last little bit, but thanks. Excellent presentation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joel Bagwandian. As I mentioned to Joel offline, I did introduce him previously before his arrival, but just to remind, he is a finance professional with 2 decades of experience in financial management, banking, and finance, and has written a great deal on the oil and gas sector. And he's also a commissioner of the Public Procurement Commission in Guyana that oversees public procurement in the country to ensure transparency, accountability, and efficiency in the use of funds. So, Joel, without further ado, you're on mute now, but if you take off your mute, I'd turn it over to you for 15 minutes. If you can organize yourself within that time period, that would be excellent.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm not sure what you mean by organize myself within 15 minutes. You mean I have 15 minutes to present?
To present, yes, you do.
All right. So good evening once again, and thank you for this opportunity, Professor Professor Griffith. Your book is I think it's an excellent piece. It is very comprehensive. And I'm very fortunate to have been cited in your book, my work being cited quite extensively. So thank you for those citations as well. So Professor Griffith asked me to speak on two things, two topics, local content and the low carbon development strategy. Now, the speaker before me, Professor Hunt, ended on a note where I think I could pick up from by answering the question he asked, which is, should countries seek to be compensated? And he referenced a green state development strategy. Now, the good news in the case of Guyana is that Guyana is perhaps the only country in the world that has pioneered what was called a low carbon development strategy of 2009. And that low carbon development strategy answers exactly that very question. And it's not a matter of an idea in the case of Guyana. We have done exactly that vis-a-vis the 2009 low carbon development strategy, which allowed us to, during the period of 2009, since its establishment to 2015, we've earned about $213 million from Norway, which was an agreement. Norway was essentially paying us to maintain our standing forests. And what we used that resource to do was to finance climate adaptation investments and promote low carbon development policies, including in the business sector, supporting green businesses and so on. The low carbon development strategy has been updated. The expanded version of the low carbon development strategy seeks to build on that model. And the current model monetizes our resources, and we have been able to secure carbon credit sales in the sum of over $700 million in our first carbon credit sale by one of the oil companies paying for that. Then we had another recent transaction with another multi-global firm, Apple, purchasing some more carbon credit. So we've sold just over 30% of our carbon credit. That has allowed us to earn close to $1 billion, and that funding, the proceeds from that funding, is being channeled towards financing the low carbon development strategy. Now, I also want to state, in listening to the presentation by the other distinguished panelists, the thrust of Dr. Griffith's book is about the perils of climate change, which is a real threat in terms of our prosperity, in terms of our economic development. And it comes down to realizing the goals of a low carbon development strategy in terms of addressing and mitigating those risks. It comes down to financing financial resources. And there is always the constraint of financial resources. And why this model is important the important feature that I'd like to highlight in our model is that previously, Dr. Hunt referenced a green state development strategy, which was a strategy under a previous administration. And that green state development strategy was a strategy that had to be funded from some source. Unlike the low carbon, which is generating funding by being paid for our resources, the forest resources that we have, and then deploying that resources towards low carbon development strategy. Why this is important to note is globally, when you look at climate financing, and one of the presenters spoke of the 2050, the net zero target of 2050, which is not realistic, and he's quite correct. And one of the reasons for that is because we don't have financial commitment apart from other geopolitical and other factors. One of the primary factors is the financial commitment towards achieving net zero by 2050 on a global scale. And many of the countries, they have high debt burden, and the funding comes from traditional sources. The funding still comes from traditional sources, which is multilateral. So Guyana, coming back to the case of Guyana, we're the only country in the world that has been able to create this innovative low carbon development strategy that seeks to, rather than relying and waiting on the multilateral and waiting on the rest of the world to develop climate financing, we've developed our own model. And which partly finances some of the climate adaptation infrastructure, such as sea defense infrastructure, biodiversity preservation, replanting the mangroves, and shifting development towards more inland, towards the south, as Dr. Griffith would acknowledge in his book, where development has to move towards the south. He acknowledged Silica City, so I don't want to regurgitate all of that. So to summarize the low carbon development strategy, it's an innovative model that seeks to finance our climate low carbon development goals, in part, not fully. Some of that financing still has to come from other sources, such as the resources from the oil revenue and other sources to finance those climate adaptation. I saw too, one of the distinguished panelists highlighted the 2005 flood. And one good example is, unlike other countries, and unfortunately for Guyana, our major climate risk is flooding. We are not subject to hurricane and volcanoes and earthquake, fortunately. And so the 2005 flood was the most devastating flood of which its impact cost us about 60% of our GDP. And one of the solutions in responding to that flood was the Hope Canal infrastructure. So as part of the LCDS, the Low Carbon Development Strategy of Guyana, and our climate adaptation investments, part of that plan is to invest in more such like investment, Hope Canal type of investment. And as well, you mentioned, one of the presentation mentioned drainage and irrigation and so on. So that is what in our case, climate adaptation and climate infrastructure, those are the things we have to invest in, because we are prone to flooding and being below the low carbon, the low coastal plain, which is below sea level and so on. So that's all I will say for now. I'll leave the rest for the Q&A session on the low carbon development strategy. On the topic of the local content, Professor Hunt correctly acknowledges the limitations of the agreement that we have when the agreement was negotiated, and recognizing that the local content legislation that we've enacted seeks to maximize the in-country value. And it was not an easy task to get to the legislation, because the oil companies, they typically do not like legislation and the local content legislation. So they fought fiercely against a legislation. However, the local private sector succeeded with the support of the government of the day to move towards a legislation. But it was a legislation that did not ignore the oil companies' concerns. It was a legislation that seeks to take into account those concerns and seeks to create an environment, a regulatory environment that is flexible. That legislation was passed in 2021. Today we're in 2025. And as a result of that legislation, we've been able to maximize our in-country spend, in-country value by at least $1 billion. That is $1 billion more in United States dollars, more coming to the country, not necessarily to the treasury, but to the country, to the people, to the private sector. And there are three key features of the local content legislation. There is the promoting local companies, promoting local employment of Guyanese at a certain threshold, and thirdly, training and capacity. Three key features: training and capacity and knowledge transfer and so on. So the last data that I have in my possession, we now have nearly 2,000 local companies that have active contracts supplying the oil and gas sector, participating in the oil and gas sector value chain on account of the local content legislation. And in terms of employment, we have over 6,000, which is a conservative number. It's more than 6,000 by now, but over 6,000 Guyanese employees in the oil and gas value chain. All of that would not have been achieved without the legislation. And today, that local content spend, which is projected to increase proportionately as we increase production, today it accounts for about 4% of our GDP. Now, there's some other things that that some of the panelists mentioned that I would love the opportunity to comment on, but I will not do so at this point in time. I'll wait for maybe the Q&A segment or some other appropriate opportunity on the panel to do so. So thank you.
Joel, thank you very much. You managed that time very well, and it came in just before I was going to give you the 3-minute warning. But we will have time for some questions, I believe. So I'll turn now to Janet Bulkin, who has been quite patient listening to all of us. And I am really looking forward to what I understand her presentation will be, which is focused on some of the. Well, I'm not going to prejudge it. I'll let Janet talk about it. But Janet, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robert. And yes, I'm the gender equity person on this panel. Really happy to have heard all of the presentations. Ivelaw, congratulations again. I'd like to begin by saying to you, Norman, that there is no territorial dispute with Venezuela. There is a controversy. The border between Guyana and Venezuela was settled, full, final, and perfect settlement in 1899. So no dispute, there's a controversy. I'd also like to pick up on what both Kenrick and Joel talked about, the low carbon development strategy. To begin by stating really clearly that it's what exists, it's a ragbag of projects. It is in no way a strategy like we have in Guyana, and we have the great example of the National Development Strategy that was over 200 Guyanese came together, produced over 30 chapters of the NDS in 1996-97. That was republished, republished on shortened in some ways in 2001. LCDS is not that kind of development strategy. It's a ragbag of projects. The LCD, they are following on from that, the idea that we are sequestering the huge numbers of gigatons of carbon is fallacious. Trees breathe. Trees, yes, trees breathe in and breathe out. So what the gigatons that you have, Ivelaw, in your book, which Winrock estimated, there's no reputable scientist who will endorse that. Trees breathe and breathe out. Our forests are in equilibrium. So in fact, Guyana, this really optimistic picture you present, Guyana, with the emissions, we have to include scope 1 to scope 3 emissions in our calculations. And if we do that, then you can see we are really a huge producer of carbon dioxide. I would like to, because I am interested in issues of governance and I'm interested in issues of democracy, I read in our newspapers over the last week, talked about the Trinidadian Minister of Energy. And he stood up in a Trinidadian parliament and said he understood that he wasn't quite sure. He thought there were 650,000 people in Guyana, and Guyana was producing 700,000 barrels of oil. And a number of people sort of thought about the minister's, what he said, and thought, well, let's forget the 650,000. We probably are about 800,000 people in Guyana. We do not know. Why? Because up until now, the 2022 national census has not been released. So we have absolutely no idea how many Guyanese there are. And again, it's the kind of the conundrum of being this, middle income country with an inability to have any clear statistics on which you can do planning, like planning for development. But if we are 800,000 people, let's just guess that. We have no census. And we are producing 700,000, we're pumping 700,000 barrels of oil a day. We have to ask ourselves, why are 48% of Guyanese living on less than $650 per day, according to the World Bank? And I think it's a central issue. It's been 10 years since oil was discovered. We hear these grandiose figures about GDP, which is high, pushing us into the middle income bracket. In reality, if you live in Guyana, you see both great poverty, and more than that, you see the fear of all kinds of strata of Guyanese living behind walls, afraid of each other. We just have not built a social compact with our oil money. And this is a matter, I think, of something to think about as Guyanese. We're all here. What would we need to do to build that social compact, build governance with oil revenues? And I wanted to just use my time as well to think about some of the sectors we see here and who are reflecting on what it is to live in a time of oil. So in the newspapers in Guyana in April of this year, Priti Paul Singh, who is the largest owner of trawlers, was belaboring what's happened, this catastrophic fall down in his production of CBOB. So they've gone from exporting 20 containers of CBOB per year to 2 containers of CBOB. The second largest producer of CBOB, Noble House, has actually folded. It's quietly not doing anything, nor is number 3. And that story of what the CBOB, we have 87 trawlers, and what Gatos, who represents them, or their association, is sort of defunct now or not speaking. But what they say, the one constant that they see is oil. Correlation is not causation. But when they look across to Suriname, which has only 27 trawlers in operation, there is the same catastrophic fall down in CBOB production. Similarly, closer to home, artisanal fishers will tell you that they are spending longer periods out and coming back with less fish, but because their own data collection is poor, we have no, those stories all correlate or are in the same levels of magnitude as the CBOB, the trawling industry. All of these people who share that space with oil, where, as Dr. Monroe said, ultra deep water conditions, talk about they see the catastrophe as, yes, partly climate change, but they see another constant is oil production. So we can't sort of think about, we can produce oil as much as we wish. What Exxon wants, Exxon dictates, or the consortium dictates, and that there will be no consequences. There are consequences. Fishers who are a large percentage are illiterate. They talk about vibrations in the water. They say when them man dig, we feel it. And that's clearly the seismic surveys and the intense rate of activity in this shared marine space, which may be related, along with climate change, to this fall down in production of food for Guyanese. I'm in Georgetown. I can tell you that fish is very expensive. And recently, when I did an interview on oggn.org with some women, they said, we just can't afford to buy fish. Fish is produced, yes. Wealthier Guyanese, some of those Joel mentioned, enjoying the billions of dollars, getting the 6,000 people who are well paid, they will always be able to afford fish. But we have not safeguarded in the same way the shared marine space. I think as well, we should, as OGGN has pointed out, that every day the consortium is dumping into this shared marine space the equivalent of 5 Marriott hotels in volume of hot produced water, which is untreated, it's full of chemicals, it's full of pollutants. Think of it, a Marriott hotel, which most Guyanese can relate to, 5 of those per day being dumped into this space. So the negative externalities are not, of course, are for Guyanese fishers, Guyanese consumers, the trawler people, also for all the marine life with which we share our space. And so I think partly what we can think of when we think of this bonanza, as you put it, of oil and gas, we can also think of zones of sacrifice. As many have written about oil elsewhere in Nigeria, in other parts of the world, where the people who bear the brunt of it are those who are right up close, like fishers, like trawlers, like the Guyanese people. We can talk about our forests. Well, we are one of the largest users of mercury, certainly in Latin America. And so many of our great rivers are polluted. So yes, we have trees, but we allow the unmanaged export of the hard and heavy prime timbers. They've been going out for the last 20 years. So we don't even say we want a mix of timbers to go out. That's our best timbers are going out. So we have localized extinction. And our rivers mean that if you go to communities of indigenous peoples, they have to use, like us on the coast, black water tanks. We're making Trinidad really rich, someone there, with black water tanks, because the rivers are so polluted. So pollution in Guyana, pollution outside means that we have these zones of sacrifice to Exxon. And I think one of the, after 2015, well, beginning of 2018, I think we had Dr. Jan Mangal in Guyana for a year or two. And he raised some questions, I think, which Guyanese should still think about. And Jan Mangal maintained in letters week after week, or very often in the press, that Guyana had under 1 million people. And so Guyana could plan, because it had this really, this legacy, this great gift of sweet crude oil, really desirable. We could choose on what basis and how much needed to be extracted, and the uses to which it would be put, not to run more polluting vehicles on our roads, but to be used in sophisticated, the kinds of things Dr. Monroe was talking about, sophisticated uses of petroleum at our dictates, instead of which we have allowed Exxon to dictate how much oil is produced with complete recklessness. Complete recklessness, because if there were to be an oil spill, as you alluded to, Dr. Griffith, there is no parent company guarantee to cover the costs of trying to ameliorate it or alleviate its harms, not just to Guyana, but to all the countries of the Caribbean who share our marine space. So we allow ourselves, as we did in the colonial period, to be dictated to by a foreign post-colonial or current viceroys in the pace they want. That suits their shareholders. That suits their shareholders. They're doing just fine. So we saw, as you mentioned, that Chevron is willing to pay 55 billions or more, 58, I can't remember, for Hess's share. Today's newspapers say probably they're going to get it. Guyana gets not 1 cent of that, as Kendrick mentioned. If we minus what we are, 3 minutes.
It's like we're down to 3 minutes, okay?
I'm done. If we take away the taxes we're paying for oil companies without even bothering to try to negotiate and renegotiate bits, we don't have to renegotiate the whole contract. We can put in requirements every time they want a field development plan to be approved. We could then get some returns to Guyana. In fact, what we get are the negative externalities. We have hideous traffic, hideous pollution on the roads of Guyana, inflationary effects which burden local people and also burden people who are trying to make a living in the non-oil economy. Because what they say to me, what they've been saying to me is, global prices are fixed. We can't say to our global buyers, look, our cost of production is now so high because they'll find someone else to supply them with fish or whatever else it is, whatever it is we produce. We are suffering those negative impacts with very little of the benefits. And so I think from the point of view of ordinary Guyanese, you have to think about the last 10 years and the trajectory we're on. Are we moving towards more democracy? If we were, let's see what our population is. Let's see what our rate of our poor people are, how many there are. With recent data, we have a functioning Bureau of Statistics. Let it work. Instead of which we see the authoritarianism of our post-colonial period continuing merrily and underpinned by the wealth of oil and the borrowings we can do from Exim Bank with that oil. So I'm afraid zones of sacrifice, that's what I see. That's what we are, stuck between the marine space and our interior that's despoiled by mercury, gold mining, and all the, last thing I would say is LCDS. Guess what's happened since LCDS? We give more and more allowances and tax breaks to miners, gold miners, and to loggers to bring in more duty-free instead of protecting the environment, to despoil it more. Thank you.
Thank you for that challenging presentation. I really appreciate it. I know that just looking at some of the reactions to some of what you said, there are probably questions from the panel, not only to you but to each other. I know Joel said he would have a few questions later. Before I turn to Joel and others, I wanted to go to our audience. There are several questions that have come in. I'm going to try to roll them together a little bit. From Emma Charles, she talks about the mention of future regional partnerships, particularly between Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad. Could you, this isn't directed at anybody in particular, comment on what that deeper collaboration might look like, particularly, and this is when I'm rolling in another one of her questions, particularly when thinking about local content, what more needs to be done to develop local skills and training? Are there specific areas we should prioritize? And I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator just to add a third part to that question. Some of the member institutions of the Canada Caribbean Institute have been quite active in the past couple of years in offering and starting training, TVET programs, training and vocational education programs in Guyana. I'm thinking of George Brown College, and I believe McMaster or U of T have programs down there as well. are there other areas beyond oil and gas, or are there specific slices of that sector where our members might think about additional programming in Guyana? So kind of a big question, but let's start maybe with, what does the regional partnership that was described look like? How would that be given meaning? I'm not sure which of you first raised that, whether it was Norman or Kendrick, but
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about it. I'm thinking of, say, Trinidad and Tobago has 10 ammonia plants, 7 methanol plants, 4 LNG facilities, and they're processing natural gas. They have refineries to produce gasoline. They have natural gas, which is their source of energy, inexpensive energy. And so a regional collaboration or cooperation could be in terms of industries that require a lot of energy. Let the country that has the cheap source of energy focus on that type of manufacturing. Countries with resources for agriculture, like Guyana. Guyana can feed the entire Caribbean. And then you have CARICOM, that umbrella for the regional cooperation. I'm not so much knowledgeable in terms of economic arrangements between countries and working under one umbrella, such as CARICOM. There are others who are more experienced with the economics of those situations. Maybe Professor Hunt could give some insight in terms of how that works. But I'm just looking in terms of practically working where you have the advantage. So you focus on the things that are amenable to your advantage. And so countries can work in that way for the benefit of the entire Caribbean, and in terms of being a global partner, so to speak. And the Caribbean would have that kind of industrial, whether it's agricultural or some of the industries that I talk about, like hydrogen production. Guyana could dominate in terms of hydrogen production from natural gas. Trinidad with petrochemicals, and somehow under the CARICOM umbrella, find a way to make this work. So that's what I was hinting at.
Okay, thank you, Norman. Anyone else on the panel with a perspective they want to share on that sort of set of general questions? If not, Joel, I know you said you had some questions of some of the other panelists. I'd invite you to maybe pitch in with a couple of those, and indicate to the other panelists that if you have some for other members of the panel, we can do a bit of a round robin that way. I'd like to leave the final word to Ivelaw, though, before we close. But Joel, if you could maybe jump in.
Thank you, Robert. It was not questions. I have some comments. Yes.
Either way, I'm sure they'll elicit responses.
So I'd like to respond to a few things that Dr. Vulcan mentioned in her presentation. The first is that the notion that the oil company is dictating the rate at which we're producing, that is inaccurate. It is a matter of national policy or government policy to, as quickly as possible, ramp up production. So it is not the oil companies dictate, it is the government's dictate. Whether we agree on the rate of production, that's a different matter, and that's open for debate, and that's fine. But who dictates the policy? The policy is dictated by the government of the day. Now, having said that, on the on the issue of the poverty rate by the World Bank. On one hand, we're talking about Guyana being classified as a middle-income country using some indicators reclassified by the World Bank. And at the same time, we still have some level of poverty. The 48%, again, that is debatable. And I've challenged the World Bank myself on that, which was a matter of public record. And they have since withdrawn. They have since removed that report that they published that continues to be referenced. If you go and look for it now, it's no longer there. They've removed it because I've challenged them publicly and directly through their office in Guyana that 48% is inaccurate. And we have to understand and appreciate our history. And our history is one in which we came from a bankrupt country 3 decades ago. And we had a long, painful period of recovery. There was a time in the late 80s when our debt to GDP was 9 times the size of our economy. There was a time when our debt service was 150% of revenue. In 2005, when we had the Great Flood, in 2006, that was the year we exited the IMF program. That was the year we were considered an economically viable country, the restoration of economic viability and financial viability. So we've had long years of financial constraints coming from a state of bankruptcy at a time when our poverty rate was 97%. Today, while Dr. Bulkan referenced that the Bureau of Statistics should work, the Bureau of Statistics is working. While the report is not officially released to the public, those who have working relationship with the Bureau of Stats, like myself, because I do a lot of research and I engage with the Bureau of Stats, and the poverty number is far less than 48%. It is actually under 20%. And we can't beat up everybody because in the United States, it takes about 10 years to conduct a census with all of the resources and technology that they have. It takes about 4 or 5 years to get to the final report. They would publish different versions, preliminary reports, and so on. Now, but the fact of the matter is that our poverty rate is below 48%, notwithstanding recognizing that there still is poverty. On one hand, we talk about zones of sacrifice. Well, I wouldn't call it zones of sacrifice. I would call it, in everything, a country has to decide whether we want to develop and monetize our resources. And the question really is, how do we develop and monetize our resources to lift our people out of poverty at the lowest possible cost or the lowest possible risk? How do we mitigate those environmental risks? And that is where the conversation and academia should focus in, rather than zones of sacrifice. Should we do or should we don't? Right? And coming back to the policy, why we choose to ramp up. That is why I gave you that brief history of our economics. And that is because, as Professor Hunt mentioned, that we can all agree that the deal was a bad deal and it could have been more favorable. And so it is precisely for that reason that, as a matter of national policy, we will increase production at a rate from 120,000 barrels per day to 1.3 million barrels per day by a certain time period, which will significantly increase the revenue to the state, all things being equal, which would be in the region of about 8 to 10 billion US, all things being equal. And at which time the recovery cost of the capital invested will have been fully recovered, and there will be no further explanation in accordance with the 2016 agreement. And that 14.5% that Professor Hunt mentioned, according to my forecasting model, will increase to about 25-30%, significantly increasing the take to the government. So
may I just stop you there? You missed at the beginning that that Janet, and maybe this was in our private chat, but Janet has a hard stop at 8 p.m. And so I just want to give her an opportunity to maybe respond to some of your points, and then we can turn to the rest of the panel. Janet, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, Joel is speaking in the royal we. I guess the we is his close affiliation to government. I know also he said to the press in 2020, last year, that he had terminated his relationship, his contract with ExxonMobil. So here's someone whose full disclosure has a particular position. I have none of that. I would like to say, just to say to Robert, in terms of Guyana and democracy and who should be the we should be in the Parliament of Guyana. We are a deeply divided country, and the governing political party was there with just one seat, one extra parliamentarian than the opposition. So to begin to give a sense of how deeply divided and undemocratic Guyana is, so when only a few people decide what we is and how much we will pump and when. We had elections in 2020, and there were three political parties which came together, and they had one seat. The first one, the one they decided in their own gentlemen and gentlewomen's agreement that they would share their time in Parliament. The smallest one had under 250 votes, the smallest of the three parties, and was supposed to be the third party that would be in Parliament. Because a party which has just one seat could be strategic, could use it strategically and maybe be that voice, as we did when Ravi Dev was in Parliament with Roar, when Clive Thomas was with WPA. We had really excellent conversations. This small party with less than 250 votes asked to go into Parliament, I think it was in 2023. Within 2 months of being in Parliament, was elevated to being the Deputy Speaker of the Assembly, giving the governing party a cushion of one extra seat. So that's the kind of that we have, WE, where you have this travesty where the Parliament doesn't function, and there is not a single thing which the opposition parliamentarians can propose which is ever taken up. We do not have a functioning democracy, and we see with oil this deepening authoritarianism, which is enabled and made even more powerful with oil funds and the borrowings that we are doing with it. So we means the governing party. There is no single item which has gone through the Parliament of Guyana, but the opposition parties, which has been taken up. No legislation has been modified. And that's what's frightening about oil and our zones of sacrifice. We are the recipients of that kind of position. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. We've got to leave shortly, but I just want to say this dialogue, this discussion, just makes me wish that we had a lot more time to get into it, because as I said at the beginning, I mean, Ivelaw has written a book close to almost 500 pages. It's incredibly rich with data, with legal argument and so on. But it's this kind of public debate where you see I guess, the way in which Guyana is really faced into the future with some hard and difficult choices. It's 8 o'clock. I don't want to go over too long. I know there are people who have some other questions. I know the panelists may have other questions too of each other, but I wanted to maybe turn it over to you to maybe draw this to a close. And if we can find a way of doing something more detailed in the future on some of these issues, I'd be happy to try to organize it. But Ivelaw, maybe I could turn to you.
Thank you, Robin. I just want to make 2 quick observations. The first of which is to say, I have every expectation that the issues which have been addressed here this evening, which are only a partial reflection of what the book is all about, will have further contentious, hopefully civil engagement. I'm hoping that that engagement will be both virtual And I welcome the opportunity, Robert, for further conversation, as well as in Guyana. The matters both on the promise side and the peril side are too important not to have these conversations. And I want to thank Norman, Joel, Janet, and the ambassador for beginning the conversation, for the critiques, for the contributions. My final note is this. You referred rightly, Rob, to the availability of the book on Amazon. For those who are interested in the ebook, it's available on Book Fusion. And the publisher told me that they'll be working on an audiobook soon. I'm hoping that the audiobook is available before the end of the year. But I think the subjects of the promise and the peril of oil and climate change warrants further conversation. These matters are too important to be left only to an academic like Ivelaw Griffith and other academics.
It's an excellent discussion that we've all started here this evening. I want to thank you, Ivelaw, and the panelists, Norman Monroe, Kendrick Hunt, Janet Bulkin, and Joel Bagwandan for agreeing to participate and for putting up with some of my organizational emails over the last month or so. But well done, everyone. And I will let you know as soon as this is put up on the Canada Caribbean Institute website, and I would really encourage you to give it some circulation in your networks and so on. And thank you to the audience. I know that there were a couple of questions that we didn't get to. I apologize for that, but no doubt this is not the last word on some of these issues. So stay tuned, and once again, thank you, everyone. But I think I will draw it to a close right now to stay in time.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you and good evening.
Bye-bye.
And bye.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.